The morning ritual. Thomas Walker had been driving the number 42 bus through Pinewood Heights for 7 years. The route never changed. 38 stops through the sleepy suburban neighborhoods past Westfield Mall and finally to the community college before looping back. What did change were the faces, a revolving cast of characters that Thomas prided himself on knowing. There was Mr. Jenkins, the retired postal worker who always carried a thermos of coffee and commented on the weather. The Donovan twins, high school sophomores who tumbled onto the bus with their oversized backpacks and endless teenage energy. And Beatrice, the elderly florist who often brought Thomas a single carnation on Fridays. But then there was her, the woman at stop 17, Maple Street. She boarded precisely at 7:42 a.m. each morning, rain or shine. Thomas had been noticing her for months now. She wasn't particularly flashy or attention-seeking, quite the opposite. She carried herself with a quiet grace that seemed almost out of place in the morning rush. Her chestnut hair was always neatly pulled back, and she wore simple, professional clothing, button-up blouses and pencil skirts that suggested an office job somewhere downtown. "Good morning," Thomas would say, just as he did to every passenger. And just like every morning for the past 4 months, she would walk past without acknowledging him, finding her way to the same spot. 3rd row from the back, window seat on the right side. Thomas wasn't bothered, not really. In a city this size, people built walls. He understood that. But something about her silence felt different. It wasn't rudeness or distraction. She never had earbuds in or stared at her phone like most of the other commuters. Instead, she always carried a book, real books with paper pages, not e-readers, and would immediately lose herself in whatever story occupied her hands that week. Maybe she's just shy, Thomas had told his roommate Dion one evening over dinner. Or having a perpetual bad day. Or maybe she's just not interested in talking to her bus driver, Dion had replied with a laugh. Not everyone needs to be your friend, Tom. Perhaps Dion was right. Thomas had always been a people person. It's what made him good at his job. He remembered names, faces, and the little details people shared. He noticed when regular passengers were missing and welcomed them back with genuine concern. His supervisor had even mentioned that passenger satisfaction ratings on Route 42 had improved since Thomas took over. But this woman, he didn't even know her name, remained a mystery. One Tuesday in early October, as autumn leaves swirled across the sidewalk at stop 17, Thomas watched her approach through the folding doors. Today she wore a deep burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse, and her book was bound in dark blue with gold lettering he couldn't quite make out. "Good morning," he said, offering his standard smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" No response. Not even a glance his way as she tapped her transit card and moved down the aisle. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Thomas caught her reflection in his rearview mirror. For just a moment their eyes met in the glass. There was something in her gaze, not coldness, but something he couldn't quite name. Then she looked down at her book, and the moment was gone. 2 elderly women near the front were discussing a community garden project, their voices carrying through the morning chatter. "Did you hear they're closing the Franklin Street Library?" one said. "Budget cuts." Thomas noticed a slight change in the woman's posture in his mirror. Her head had lifted from her book, her attention seemingly caught by the conversation, though the women sat far ahead of her. Interesting. So she could hear just fine. Why then did she never respond? The mystery of the silent passenger at stop 17 continued to intrigue Thomas as the autumn days grew shorter. He learned her schedule by heart. She took his bus every weekday morning and caught the 5:30 p.m. return bus 3 days a week. Tuesdays and Thursdays she disappeared into the evening through some other means. "Good morning," he said again the next day, expecting nothing in return. The ritual continued, a one-sided greeting that had somehow become the most intriguing part of his day. Notes in the rain November arrived with a vengeance, bringing torrential downpours that turned Pinewood Heights into a glistening sodden maze. On this particular Thursday morning, the rain hammered against the windshield of bus 42 with such ferocity that Thomas had to slow his usual pace, peering carefully through the rhythmic sweep of wipers that barely kept up with the deluge. The bus was half empty today. Weather like this meant many regular commuters had opted to work from home or catch rides with neighbors. As Thomas approached stop 17, he wasn't even sure she would be there. Who would brave this storm willingly? But there she stood, a solitary figure beneath a navy blue umbrella that struggled against the wind. Her usual composed appearance was slightly disheveled. The hem of her pants darkened with rainwater, her hair escaping its usual neat arrangement. The doors hissed open. "Morning," Thomas greeted, offering a sympathetic smile. "Nasty out there, isn't it?" As always, no response came. She shook her umbrella outside before closing it, then moved down the aisle, leaving a trail of raindrops in her wake. Today the bus was empty enough that he could hear the soft squeak of her wet shoes against the floor. Thomas pulled away from the curb carefully, mindful of the puddles that could splash pedestrians. The windshield began to fog slightly with the sudden influx of damp passengers, and he adjusted the defogger. The journey continued in the hushed atmosphere that rainy days always brought. A contemplative silence broken only by the drumming of water on the roof and the occasional squeal of the wipers. In his mirror, Thomas noticed her book was absent today. Instead, she gazed out the window, tracing patterns in the condensation with her fingertip. At Westfield Mall, several passengers disembarked beneath the covered entrance. As Thomas waited for the light to change, a movement caught his eye. The woman had stood up early, gathering her belongings. Strange. Her stop was still 10 minutes away. She made her way to the front, holding the handrails carefully as the bus swayed. Thomas assumed she wanted to exit at the next stop instead of her usual one, perhaps to avoid walking too far in the rain. But as she reached the area behind his seat, she stumbled. The bus had hit an unexpected pothole, sending a wave of water over the sidewalk and jolting everyone inside. The woman lost her grip and her bag fell, contents spilling across the floor. Thomas immediately put on the hazard lights and pulled to the side of the road. "Take your time, folks. Just making a quick stop," he announced to the few remaining passengers before turning to help her. She was already on her knees, hastily gathering her scattered belongings, a wallet, some makeup, a small agenda, and several loose papers. Thomas knelt down to assist, retrieving a small notebook that had slid near his feet. As he handed it back to her, the notebook fell open, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting. She reached for it quickly, but not before Thomas caught a glimpse of what appeared to be notes about lip-reading exercises and sign language practice schedules. Their eyes met, and for the first time she really looked at him. Not through him or past him, but directly at him with an expression of vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Thomas picked up one more item, a small card that had fallen face up. It was an identification card for the Pinewood Heights Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. The woman's photo smiled back at him alongside her name, Naomi Preston. Understanding dawned on Thomas like the slow break of sunlight through storm clouds. She hadn't been ignoring him. She couldn't hear him. Naomi quickly tucked the card away, her cheeks flushed with what might have been embarrassment. She zipped her bag closed and stood up, nodding a quick thanks before turning toward the door. "Wait," Thomas said automatically, then realized his mistake. He reached for his notepad, the small one he kept for jotting down schedule changes or passenger requests, and quickly scribbled a note. He tore out the page and held it out to her. Naomi hesitated, then accepted the paper. Thomas had written, "I'm Thomas. I've been saying good morning to you for months. I'm sorry I didn't realize you couldn't hear me." Something shifted in her expression, relief perhaps, or appreciation. She took the notepad from his hand and wrote a response, her handwriting much neater than his. "I'm Naomi. I read lips sometimes, but it's hard when people speak quickly or look away. I've seen you saying something each morning but couldn't catch what it was. Thank you for being kind enough to write." Thomas read her words and smiled. He wrote back, "Would it be okay if I learned how to say good morning properly? In sign language, I mean?" The question hung between them, more significant than its simple words suggested. Naomi studied his face for a moment as if searching for something. Then slowly she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and nodded. She wrote again, "That would be nice. I get off work at 5:30 tomorrow. Central Library has good books on ASL on the second floor." Thomas felt an unexpected flutter of excitement as he helped her to the door. Before stepping off, Naomi turned back and performed a simple gesture. Her hand moved from her mouth outward. Even without training, Thomas understood it was her way of saying thank you. As Bus 42 continued its route through the rain-slicked streets, Thomas found himself repeating that gesture, committing it to memory. The mystery of the silent passenger had unraveled into something he hadn't expected. an invitation to learn a new language, to understand a different world. At the end of his shift, Thomas didn't head straight home as usual. Instead, he made a detour to the Central Library, where he found himself standing before shelves of books on American Sign Language, ready to learn his first words in a language of hands and expressions. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside something new had begun, a conversation years in the making, finally ready to take shape. Learning a new language. The Central Library's second floor was quieter than the main level. With its warm lighting and soft carpet muffling footsteps, Thomas found himself returning here every evening after his shift, fingers tracing across book spines in the specialized languages section. He'd never been much of a reader. His apartment contained more sports magazines than books. But now he carried a library card in his wallet for the first time since high school. "Back again, Mr. Walker?" Ms. Hargrove, the librarian with silver-streaked hair and cat-eye glasses, smiled as she checked out his growing stack of materials. "Still working on it," Thomas replied, somewhat sheepishly. On top of his pile was ASL for Beginners, below that Deaf Culture and Introduction, and at the bottom, a DVD on conversational sign language. "You know," Ms. Hargrove said, scanning the barcodes, "we have a practice group that meets here on Wednesdays. People learning ASL, all levels. 7 to 8:30 in room 3. Thomas glanced at his watch. "Wednesday, 6:45. They'd welcome a newcomer," she added, pushing his materials across the counter with an encouraging nod toward the community rooms. 15 minutes later, Thomas found himself sitting awkwardly in a circle with 7 strangers, his large hands resting unused on his knees while the others conversed in fluid, silent movements. First time, a friendly-looking man in his 40s slid into the empty chair beside Thomas. He simultaneously signed while speaking, a practice Thomas would learn called Simcom. "I'm Julian. Been coming for about a year now, Thomas. And yeah, first time. I barely know the alphabet." Julian grinned. "Perfect place to start then." "Why are you learning?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He hadn't actually told anyone about Naomi, not even Dion. Somehow, his morning greetings and this newfound mission felt private, almost sacred. "There's someone I want to talk to," he said simply. Julian nodded, requiring no further explanation. "The best reason." The group was led by Valerie, a coda, child of deaf adults, who had grown up signing before she could speak. She walked Thomas through the basics with patience, correcting his clumsy fingers with gentle adjustments. "Your hands tell stories," Valerie explained. "It's not just about individual signs, it's how they flow together. Your facial expressions, your body language. All of it matters." By 8:30, Thomas's head was spinning, but he'd learned to introduce himself and ask simple questions. His fingers ached from forming unfamiliar shapes, yet he felt a strange exhilaration. "You're coming back next week, right?" Julian asked as they packed up. Thomas nodded. "Definitely." Each morning, as Naomi boarded bus 42, Thomas would attempt a new greeting. His first effort, a simple good morning in ASL, had been met with such genuine delight that Thomas found himself practicing other phrases during red lights and coffee breaks. "You've been studying," Naomi signed one morning, her movements graceful and natural compared to his halting gestures. Thomas nodded, fingers carefully forming his response. "A little. Every day." Their conversations were brief, limited by Thomas's elementary skills and the short time between bus stops. Sometimes Naomi would correct his form or teach him a new sign. Other mornings, when the bus was crowded, they simply exchanged smiles, a silent acknowledgement of their growing connection. "Why are you learning sign language?" Dion finally asked one evening, catching Thomas practicing in front of the bathroom mirror. "You've been at it for weeks now." Thomas hesitated before answering. "Remember that passenger I told you about? The one who never responded to me? The mysterious book lady? Don't tell me you're learning a whole language just to chat up a passenger." Dion laughed, then paused when Thomas didn't join in. "Wait, seriously?" "She's deaf, Dion. She wasn't ignoring me. She couldn't hear me. We've been communicating, sort of." Dion studied his roommate with newfound interest. "That's actually pretty cool, man. Kind of romantic, even." Thomas felt his cheeks warm. "It's not like that. I'm just trying to be, I don't know, inclusive or something." But even as he dismissed Dion's suggestion, Thomas knew there was more to it. The 15 minutes he spent with Naomi each morning had become the highlight of his day. He found himself noticing details, how she tied her scarf differently depending on the temperature, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she was genuinely amused. The books she read, mostly historical fiction and science, he'd noticed. One Thursday morning, 6 weeks into his lessons, Thomas managed to ask a question he'd been practicing for days. "What do you do? For work?" Naomi's expression brightened at his improving skills. "I design websites," she signed back slowly, adapting to his beginner level. "Freelance. Work from home most days. Why take the bus?" Thomas asked, his curiosity emboldened by their growing rapport. "Office meetings. Client presentation," she explained. Then, with a small smile, "And I like the routine." The following week, Thomas arrived at the Wednesday practice group with a new determination. "I need to learn faster," he told Valerie. "Conversations, not just greetings." Valerie regarded him thoughtfully. "ASL isn't just about memorizing signs, Thomas. It's a different way of thinking, of experiencing the world." "I understand, but you care about this person," Valerie interrupted, her hands adding emphasis to her spoken words. "I can see that. But respect the language enough to learn it properly. Respect her culture enough to understand it." Thomas nodded, properly chastised. "You're right. I just want to be able to really talk with her." "Then commit to the process," Julian chimed in from across the table. "Immerse yourself. Find deaf events in the community. Watch videos with the sound off. Train your eyes to see what your ears can't hear." For the next month, Thomas devoted himself to Julian's advice. He attended a silent dinner event where speaking was prohibited, fumbling through conversations with patient strangers who corrected and encouraged him. He watched movies with closed captions, trying to catch every nuance of expression that carried meaning. He practiced until his dreams were filled with flying hands and expressive faces. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One snowy December morning, as Naomi boarded the bus stamping slush from her boots, Thomas greeted her with his usual signed, "Good morning." But today, instead of his usual simple question, his hands formed a complete sentence. "I noticed you finished your book. Was the ending good?" Naomi's surprise was evident, her eyes widening slightly before a smile spread across her face. Her hands flew in response, too quick for Thomas to follow entirely, but he caught enough to understand her enthusiasm about the plot twist she hadn't seen coming. When she realized she'd signed too rapidly, she slowed down, adding, "Sorry. Excited. You're getting very good." Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the bus's heating system. "I have a good teacher," he signed back. As she moved toward her usual seat, Naomi paused, then turned back to add, "There's a holiday gathering for the deaf community this weekend. Saturday evening. Community Center on Elm Street." Her hands hesitated for a moment before adding, "Would you like to come?" "As my guest?" Thomas's heart performed an unexpected leap. His hands, steadier than his pulse, formed a simple reply, "I would like that very much." That night, Thomas stayed at the library until closing, practicing holiday greetings and conversational phrases until Miss Hargrove gently reminded him they were locking up. Walking home through the gently falling snow, Thomas realized that in learning to speak without words, he had found a voice he never knew he needed, one that spoke directly from his hands to Naomi's understanding eyes, bridging the silence that had once seemed impassable between them. Beyond words, the Pinewood Heights Community Center had been transformed for the holiday celebration. String lights adorned the walls, casting a warm glow over the large gymnasium where at least 100 people mingled. Thomas stood just inside the entrance, a bottle of wine clutched in one hand, the other absently adjusting his collar. He'd changed shirts 3 times before settling on a deep blue button-down that Dion assured him looked decent enough. "Looking for someone?" Thomas turned to find an older woman signing to him, her expression friendly. "Yes," he signed back carefully. "Naomi Preston invited me." The woman's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, Naomi's bus driver." Her hands moved with excitement. "She told us about you." "I'm Evelyn, her aunt." Before Thomas could respond, he spotted Naomi approaching from across the room. She wore a green dress that complemented her eyes, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical style. She looked different away from the bus, more relaxed, more vibrant. "Thomas, you came." Her signs were accompanied by a smile that made his careful preparation of conversational phrases momentarily flee his mind. Wouldn't miss it, he managed to sign back, hoping his nervousness wasn't too evident. Naomi took his arm, guiding him further into the gathering. Come meet everyone. What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Thomas met Naomi's friends, Philip, a graphic designer who worked with her occasionally, Jasmine, her roommate from college, and Gabriel, a music teacher at the school for the deaf. He met more of her family, not just Evelyn, but her parents, Richard and Olivia Preston, who welcomed him with warm handshakes and curious glances. So you're the famous bus driver, Richard signed, his movements sharp and precise. Naomi says you've been learning ASL for months now. Impressive commitment. Your daughter is worth the effort, Thomas replied without thinking, then felt heat rise to his face as Richard's eyebrows shot up, and Olivia hid a smile behind her hand. The evening unfolded in a blur of conversations that challenged Thomas's still developing skills. When the group moved to tables for dinner, he found himself seated between Naomi and Gabriel, who helped translate when the conversations grew too complex for Thomas to follow. It's overwhelming at first, Gabriel told him during a lull. The first deaf event I attended after losing my hearing in college, I felt like I was drowning. You lost your hearing as an adult? Thomas asked, surprised. Gabriel nodded. Meningitis at 22. Had to learn ASL from scratch while grieving the loss of music. I was a piano performance major. His hands moved elegantly, a reminder of his former life. But you adapt. You discover new ways of experiencing the world. Across the table, Philip was telling a story that had everyone laughing silently, shoulders shaking, faces alight with mirth. Thomas caught only fragments, something about a misinterpreted sign at a business meeting. He signed toilet instead of conference, Naomi explained when she noticed Thomas's confusion. The clients were very confused when he invited them all to join him there. Thomas laughed, feeling a strange wonder at this soundless joy shared among friends. When he'd imagined a deaf gathering, he'd expected something subdued and serious. Instead, he found himself in the middle of one of the most expressive animated parties he'd ever attended. After dinner came dancing. The speakers played music with heavy bass lines that vibrated through the floor. Thomas watched in fascination as couples moved to rhythms they felt rather than heard, their movements no less graceful for the absence of audible melody. Would you dance with me? Naomi asked, appearing at his side as he observed from near the refreshment table. Thomas hesitated. I'm not much of a dancer even when I can hear the music, he admitted. Naomi took his hand. Just feel it, she signed with her free hand. Through the floor, through me. As they moved to the center of the floor, Thomas focused on the vibrations rising through his feet, the pulsing lights that seemed synchronized to beats he could only partly perceive. Naomi placed his hand on her waist, guiding him into the rhythm she felt intuitively. Gradually, Thomas stopped thinking and started feeling. He watched Naomi's movements and matched them, finding in their shared dance a conversation more fluid than any they'd managed with signs or notes. When the song shifted to something slower, the distance between them naturally closed, and Thomas discovered that in silence, his other senses heightened, the subtle scent of her perfume, the warmth of her hand in his, the slight pressure of her guidance. You're better than you think, she signed when they finally took a break. Her cheeks flushed from exertion. Later, as the party began winding down, Naomi suggested they step outside for some air. The December night was crisp but not bitterly cold. The community center's garden strung with more lights that reflected off patches of snow. Thank you for inviting me, Thomas signed as they found a bench beneath an old oak tree. I've never experienced anything like this. Naomi studied him in the gentle glow of the string lights. Most hearing people wouldn't make the effort you have, she signed. They expect us to adapt to their world. Thomas considered this. I never thought about it that way. I just wanted to talk to you. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Why, there are easier people to talk to. People who speak your language already. The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Thomas's hands moved slowly, forming each sign with deliberate care. Because from the first time I saw you, I felt like you had something important to say. Even before I knew you couldn't hear. Naomi's expression softened. She reached out, gently correcting the position of his fingers on one sign. her touch lingering longer than necessary. "Would you like to see where I work?" she asked suddenly. "My home office, I mean. It's not far from here." 20 minutes later, they were climbing the stairs to Naomi's second-floor apartment in a converted Victorian house. The space was open and airy, with large windows and walls painted in soft blues. One corner had been transformed into a workspace with dual monitors and an ergonomic chair. "This is where the magic happens," she signed with a touch of self-deprecating humor. "Not very exciting." "Show me what you do," Thomas requested, genuinely interested. For the next hour, Naomi demonstrated her work, pulling up websites she had designed, explaining her process of making digital spaces accessible to everyone. Thomas watched her hands move with passion as she described the importance of inclusive design. "The internet should be for everyone," she signed emphatically. "But so many sites are built by people who never consider users different from themselves. Like bus routes designed by people who've never taken public transit," Thomas offered. Naomi's face lit up. "Exactly. You understand?" As she showed him more of her projects, Thomas began to see Naomi in a new light. On his bus, she had seemed contained, almost withdrawn. Here, in her element, she was confident, expressive, brilliant. He realized how little he had known about her from their brief morning interactions. "Coffee?" she offered, moving toward the kitchen. "Or tea?" "Coffee would be great," he signed back, following her. As she prepared the drinks, Thomas noticed a piano in the corner of the living room, partially covered by a cloth. "Do you play?" he asked when she returned with 2 steaming mugs. A flash of emotion crossed Naomi's face. "I used to before." Her signs became smaller, more contained. "I was 10 when I lost my hearing. Viral infection. I had been taking lessons for 3 years." "I'm sorry," Thomas signed, immediately regretting the question. Naomi shook her head. "Don't be. I keep it because it reminds me of another life. Sometimes I place my hands on the keys and remember the vibrations." She placed her mug down and gestured toward the instrument. "Would you play something?" "I don't know how," Thomas admitted. "Just anything," she encouraged. "I want to see your hands create something different." Hesitantly, Thomas approached the piano and lifted the cloth. The keys were slightly yellowed with age but immaculately clean. He sat on the bench and pressed a few random notes, feeling awkward and exposed. Naomi came to stand beside him, placing her palm flat against the piano's side. Thomas began to play more deliberately. Nothing musical, just patterns of pressure that sent vibrations through the instrument. He watched Naomi close her eyes, a small smile forming on her lips as she experienced his improvised composition through touch alone. In that moment, Thomas understood something profound about communication, that it existed in infinite forms beyond the limitations of sound or sign. That connection could flow through vibrations, expressions, presence. When he finally stopped, Naomi opened her eyes and signed with gentle precision. "Now I've heard you." 2. The clock on her wall read past midnight when Thomas reluctantly rose to leave. At her door, he signed, "Thank you for tonight, for everything." Naomi's response was to step forward and embrace him, a hug that spoke volumes without a single sign. When they separated, Thomas found himself wanting to say more, but his still limited vocabulary failed him. "Saturday?" Naomi signed hopefully. "I could show you the botanical gardens. They have a winter light display." Thomas nodded, his hands forming his response with careful certainty. "It's a date." As he walked to the bus stop, now a passenger rather than a driver, Thomas realized that in learning Naomi's language, he had discovered something unexpected. Silence could hold more meaning than all the morning greetings he had ever spoken. The symphony of silence. 3 months had passed since the holiday party, and winter had begun yielding reluctantly to spring. Thomas and Naomi's Saturday outings had become a cherished ritual. Botanical gardens, art exhibitions, coffee shops with Sunday papers spread between them. Their conversations had evolved from halting exchanges to flowing discussions, though Thomas still occasionally stumbled when trying to express complex thoughts. Today, they walked through Pinewood Park where crocuses pushed through patches of melting snow. Thomas had been unusually quiet, his signs brief and distracted. "Everything okay?" Naomi asked, her hands cutting through the crisp afternoon air with practiced grace. Thomas nodded unconvincingly. The truth was everything was more than okay, and that was precisely what terrified him. In the months since discovering Naomi's secret, his life had transformed. His apartment now contained ASL textbooks alongside sports magazines. His Wednesday evenings belonged to the library practice group, where he'd advanced to an intermediate level. His weekends, once filled with televised games and occasional outings with Dion, now revolved around the moments he spent with Naomi. Just thinking, he finally signed back. Naomi raised an eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with his answer. She led them to a park bench overlooking the duck pond, where thin ice still clung to the edges despite the strengthening sun. "Tell me," she insisted once they were seated, her eyes searching his face with the intensity that had become familiar, the focused attention of someone who read not just signs, but every micro-expression. Thomas took a deep breath. "I've been offered a promotion," he signed, his movements revealing the conflict he felt. "Operations manager for the Eastern Transit routes." Naomi's face brightened. "Thomas, that's wonderful news." Her hands moved enthusiastically. "You deserve it. It means no more driving," he continued. "Office work, scheduling, personnel management." Understanding dawned in Naomi's eyes. "No more Route 42, Thomas nodded, the implication hanging between them. No more Route 42 meant no more morning greetings, no more watching Naomi board at stop 17 with her book tucked under her arm. The routine that had brought them together would end. "When do you start?" she asked. "They want an answer by Friday. If I accept, I begin next month." Naomi was quiet for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. Then she signed, "You should take it. It's a great opportunity." "I know, but our relationship didn't start because you drive a bus, Thomas," she interrupted, her signs direct and clear. "It started because you saw me when others didn't. Because you made the effort when others wouldn't." Thomas nodded, acknowledging her point but still troubled. "Everything is changing so fast." "Change isn't always bad," Naomi responded with a gentle smile. They continued their walk, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, but Thomas remained preoccupied. That evening, back in his apartment, he confided in Dion. "So what's the real problem?" Dion asked after hearing about the promotion. "You worried she won't be interested if you're not her bus driver anymore?" Thomas threw a couch pillow at his roommate. "It's not that. It's just, this job, Route 42, it's been my life for 7 years. I know every stop, every regular passenger. It's where I met Naomi. And now you're afraid of moving forward," Dion concluded, tossing the pillow back. Classic Thomas Walker, comfortable with the familiar, terrified of the unknown. "That's not fair," Thomas protested, though a part of him recognized the truth in Dion's assessment. "Isn't it? Remember how long it took you to ask out Jessica in high school? By the time you worked up the courage, she was dating that exchange student from Norway. His name was Frederick, and he had an accent. No competition," Thomas grumbled, but he was smiling now. "My point is," Dion continued, "you've spent months learning an entire language for this woman. Maybe it's time to take another leap." The next day, during his shift, Thomas paid special attention to each stop along Route 42. The familiar landmarks took on a bittersweet quality. Mr. Jenkins boarding with his thermos, the Donovan twins arguing about some school drama, Beatrice with her Friday carnation. Would he miss this daily pageant of humanity if he took the management position? As he approached stop 17, Thomas felt the familiar flutter of anticipation. Naomi was waiting, wearing a light jacket against the spring chill, her hair caught by a playful breeze. "Good morning," he signed as she boarded. "Morning," she replied with a smile that still made his heart skip. "Have you decided about the promotion?" "Still thinking," he admitted. Throughout the day, Thomas contemplated his options. The promotion meant better pay, regular hours, and professional advancement. But it also meant change, stepping away from the role that had defined him for years. By the time his shift ended, Thomas had made 2 decisions. First, he would accept the promotion. Second, he needed to talk to Naomi, really talk to her about what their relationship meant now that their morning routine would end. He texted her. Their written communications had moved from paper, notes to modern technology months ago. "Dinner tonight. I need to talk to you about something." They met at Riverside Cafe, a small restaurant with soft lighting and well-spaced tables that made conversation easier. After they ordered, Thomas's hands moved with purpose. "I've decided to accept the position," he signed. Naomi nodded, her expression warm. I'm proud of you, Thomas. You'll be excellent at it. But it changes things between us, he continued. No more bus rides together. Yes, she agreed simply. Things change. Thomas hesitated, then pushed forward. I don't want to lose what we have. Why would you? Naomi's eyes held a challenge. Because... Thomas stopped, struggling to articulate his fear. His hands fell still for a moment before he continued. Because maybe what connected us was the circumstance. The daily routine. The mystery of why you never responded. Maybe without that, there's nothing holding us together. Naomi's expression softened. She reached across the table, taking his restless hands in hers to still them. Then she released them to sign. Thomas Walker, for a perceptive man, you can be remarkably blind sometimes. What do you mean? Do you think I've spent every Saturday with you for 3 months because I enjoy your bus route? Do you think I invited you into my home, showed you my work, my piano, because you say good morning well? Thomas felt a flush creeping up his neck. When you put it that way, I care about you because of who you are, Naomi signed emphatically. Because when you realized I couldn't hear you, your response wasn't pity or discomfort, it was to learn my language. Do you know how rare that is? Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. When the server departed, Thomas signed, I care about you too, more than I've ever cared about anyone. The admission was easier in sign than it would have been spoken aloud, his hands steady while his voice might have trembled. Naomi smiled. I know. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, exchanging glances that carried meanings beyond words or signs. Finally, Thomas set down his fork and signed, I have something to ask you. Yes? I've been practicing this for weeks, he admitted, wanting to get it exactly right. Naomi watched expectantly as Thomas's hands began to move, forming signs with careful precision. He had rehearsed this sequence countless times in front of his bathroom mirror, determined to express himself perfectly. Before I met you, I lived in a world full of sound, but empty of real connection. You taught me that true communication goes beyond words, spoken or signed. You showed me a different way of experiencing life, and in the process, you became the most important person in mine. His hands moved fluidly now, confidence growing with each sign. I don't want just Saturdays anymore. I want mornings and evenings, weekdays and weekends. I want to continue learning your language, your world, your heart. Thomas paused, took a deep breath, and signed the question he'd been practicing most carefully of all. Naomi Preston, would you consider sharing your life with mine? Not just rides on bus 42, but a journey together, wherever it leads. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, not of sadness, but of unexpected joy. For a moment, her usually expressive hands were still. Then, rather than signing, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, similar to the one she'd dropped that rainy day months ago. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon and slid it across the table. Thomas looked down at Naomi's neat handwriting. Things I love about Thomas Walker, followed by a numbered list that spanned several pages. The first entry, dated from December, read, He tries, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. The most recent entry, from just 2 days ago. He thinks I don't notice how he watches my hands when I sign, like they're creating music he can finally hear. Thomas looked up, his vision blurring slightly. You've been keeping this list all along? Naomi nodded, then signed with elegant simplicity. My answer is yes. To all of it. Yes. Later that evening, they stood outside Naomi's apartment, reluctant to end the night despite the late hour. The street lamp cast a gentle glow over them as Thomas signed, I start the new position in 3 weeks. And I'll be waiting at stop 17 every morning until then, Naomi promised, her hands forming the words with tenderness. After that, Thomas signed, we'll need a new routine. Naomi's smile held all the warmth of future mornings yet to come. I think we'll manage. As Thomas walked home that night, the city hummed with the usual urban symphony. Car engines, distant sirens, late-night conversations from open windows. But beneath it all, he felt the presence of another rhythm, one that couldn't be heard but could be profoundly felt. The quiet cadence of hands forming words, of expressions conveying emotions, of two lives beginning to harmonize in a melody beyond sound. The following Monday, as bus 42 pulled up to stop 17, Thomas was ready with a new greeting. When Naomi boarded, his hands moved with practiced fluidity. signing not just good morning, but a phrase he had carefully learned from Valerie. Every day with you is a new discovery. Naomi's response was equally eloquent, her hands dancing through the air as she signed. And every silence we share speaks volumes. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Thomas caught Naomi's reflection in his rearview mirror. She had taken her usual seat, but instead of opening her book, she was watching him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. In that moment, Thomas understood with perfect clarity that while his days driving Route 42 might be ending, the journey they had begun together was just reaching its first glorious destination. In 3 weeks, he would hang up his driver's uniform and step into a new role, but the most important transition had already occurred, from strangers divided by silence to souls connected through it, their hands creating a language of love that required no sound to be perfectly, beautifully heard.